Jim Gardner, Executive for Legislative Archives, Presidential Libraries, and Museum Services. We are gathering in the William G. McGowan Theater, and for those of you who are visiting this building for the first time, welcome and please come back. For those of you who have been away, I want to let you know about some new additions to our museum in the 2 levels above us. In December, we opened our extraordinary new permanent exhibit, Records of Rights, in the David M. Rubenstein Gallery on the ground floor. It's part of the new entrance to the National Archives. You would have walked right by it as you came in today. And in March, this past March, in the O'Brien Gallery, which is 1 floor above us, 2 floors above us. In the O'Brien Gallery, we opened Making Their Mark, Stories Through Signatures, which tells the story of men and women ranging from George Washington and Jackie Robinson to Julia Child and Albert Einstein. All of you may find of particular interest an FBI job application from 1937 by a young Duke Law School graduate named Richard M. Nixon. So there are a lot of wonderful stories and a lot of wonderful signatures that tell those stories in the exhibit. And there's more change ahead. At Yorba Linda, the National Archives and the Nixon Foundation are embarking on the first renovation of the Nixon Library since it opened 23 years ago. We expect that renovation process to begin later this year. Now on to why we are here today. This is the 29th Nixon Legacy Forum to date, an opportunity for you to hear from alumni of the Nixon administration who can talk about what it was actually like to be there and to work on the programs and policies President Nixon proposed. They discuss the documents they wrote and worked on and talk about what it was actually like working in the Nixon White House back in the 70s. These forums provide historical context on the how, the why, and the way things happened, amplifying and illuminating the millions of documents and thousands of hours of tapes that we hold at the Nixon Library. The audio, video, and transcripts of these Nixon Legacy Forums play a part in the oral history that is available to scholars and citizens who want to learn more about the 37th President and his administration. They're available online and at the library in Yorba Linda. Most of the Nixon Legacy Forums so far have dealt with President Nixon's domestic policies, from establishing the Environmental Protection Agency and desegregating schools, to taking the bite out of organized crime and overturning almost a century of federal policy in order to guarantee the integrity and rights of American Indians. Today's program will focus on D.C. Home Rule. Between 1948 and 1966, 6 bills were introduced in Congress to provide for some sort of home rule for residents of the District of Columbia, but none passed. It was not until December 24, 1973, that Congress passed the District of Columbia Home Rule Act, which provided for a popularly elected mayor and 13-member city council, as well as for the district to have its own court system. To introduce the panelists and talk more about the foundation, it's my pleasure to introduce Jeff Shepard, who is the founder of the Nixon Legacy Forums. Jeff is a graduate of President Nixon's alma mater, Whittier College, and the Harvard Law School. He came to Washington as a White House fellow assigned to Paul Volcker at the Treasury Department, and then moved to the White House to work for John Ehrlichman as Associate Director of Domestic Counsel. Jeff?
Jim, thank you very much. And my job is to welcome you on behalf of the Richard Nixon Foundation. As Jim mentioned, the National Archives and the Foundation co-sponsor these Nixon Legacy Forums. We use the analogy to the Civil War. The Archives has all the records of the Civil War, but what they don't have is interviews with the participants to ask them why they did something in particular or why not. What we've been able to do, and this is our 29th forum, is gather together the people who produce those documents, the people who live through those initiatives, and have them as a group oral history to discuss the why and the wherefore of what was done. And today's forum is unique because it's on D.C. Home Rule, which may not have mattered a whole lot to the rest of the nation, but certainly mattered to the people who lived within the district. We're fortunate to have with us today a superbly qualified moderator, Professor Dean Kotlowski, who is a professor of U.S. political history at Salisbury University and teaches a course on America in the 1970s. In addition, Dean authored a book on Nixon's civil rights, politics, principle, and policy in 2002 that was printed by the Harvard University Press. So he's in a unique position to guide our discussion today and to hear from the people who actually delivered. If you look up D.C. Home Rule in Wikipedia, the ultimate source, you'll find something very unique. You'll find it great detail about 5 of the bills that tried to grant home rule under previous presidents, and then 1 sentence that says it was accomplished in 1973. And President Nixon's extensive involvement in the work of these people is silent. And it just shows who happened to write that particular page. So one of the delicious things about the forum today is we plan on correcting the record and showing exactly how all of this came about. And to help us, Dean Kotlowski. Welcome.
Thank you, Jeff, for those kind words, and I'm delighted to be here and with these very distinguished panelists as part of this institution. It's really become an institution, these Nixon Legacy Forums. President Richard M. Nixon's domestic policies really did not begin to receive serious scholarly examination until the 1980s and really until the 1990s. When they did, many observers were surprised. A Republican president, elected in part because of backlash against the Great Society, presided over a major expansion of the powers of the federal government in areas of environmental protection and national parks, occupational safety and old age security, mass transit, and aid to cities. Nixon also proposed major overhauls of the nation's welfare and health care systems, poured money into the arts, established an all-volunteer army, and imposed wage and price controls on an overheated economy. Such a record has led the historian James T. Patterson to dub Richard Nixon easily the most liberal Republican American president excepting Theodore Roosevelt in the 20th century. In many respects, civil rights reflected Nixon's progressive, or at least pragmatic side. The Nixon administration implemented affirmative action and sanctioned set-asides for minority-owned companies. It desegregated Southern schools, approved an expanded Voting Rights Act, and reformed federal Indian policy. Indeed, Nixon's support for voting rights, minority-run businesses, and colleges and Indian tribes reflected a self-determinationist impulse consistent with the president's commitment to devolving dollars and authority to local units of government under his new federalism. It also coincided with his implementation of a form of home rule for the District of Columbia. President Nixon's much overlooked support for home rule and economic development in the District of Columbia derived from several considerations, and I'm not going to mention all of them here. The panelists will further enlighten us. Nixon showed great interest in the structure and design of government. I think we should begin there. His administration proposed a massive reorganization of the federal government, and the president himself exhibited what the historian Joan Hoff has called a fascination with how things work, including government, especially institutions in close proximity to him, such as the District of Columbia. More importantly, Washington, D.C. was the nation's showplace, the venue to which ranking foreign officials encountered the power and majesty of the American state. Having and keeping the district in fine working order was no small imperative for a president interested primarily, but not exclusively, in foreign affairs. The president's goal was the establishment of a high-functioning, safe, and economically prosperous capital city. It also should be emphasized that Nixon exuded an abiding interest in the district, partly because he lived there for 8 years as vice president, and partly because Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a gifted writer of memorandums, stoked the president's interest in the district, and I think probably in particularly the development of Pennsylvania Avenue. And we have here our first slide of Nixon and Moynihan looking out on Pennsylvania Avenue as part of this Pennsylvania Avenue Development Commission. Moynihan's preface to the report of the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Commission proclaimed, "The preeminent fact is that the patron of the federal city is the President of the United States." Now, Nixon needed little persuading about the importance of the District of Columbia. It became, to a certain extent, the laboratory and/or point of departure for the president's anti-crime initiatives, for candidate Nixon's pledge to restore law and order was perhaps his chief domestic promise during the presidential campaign of 1968. Nixon's concern about the district was also aesthetic, and I think this is something that's often overlooked. The president's crusade to eliminate from the northwest part of the mall unsightly, quote-unquote, temporary, although they were made of concrete, so figure that out, temporary World War I-era Navy buildings, which incidentally included the Navy's main building, was perhaps Nixon's best-known attempt to beautify the nation's capital. And if you want to know what this would have looked like, there is the Lincoln Memorial in the background, the reflecting pool, and those are, you have this a couple of very, very large complexes that were part of the Navy Department. As the president looked from the window of his helicopter Marine One, he remarked, "Are those old buildings still there? I was stationed there during the war for a while. Look at the way they louse up the mall. Why are they still up?" Domestic Policy Chief John D. Ehrlichman responded that nobody had told him to knock the buildings down. To that, the president replied sharply, "Well, I'm telling you, knock them down." The Navy resisted, to the point that Robert Kunzig, the head of the General Services Administration, lamented, "You know, I always feel that if a bomb dropped on Washington, the good old U.S. Navy could be expected to fight on to victory, but if we tear down those old buildings near the White House, the whole goddamn U.S. Navy will cease to function." As presidential speechwriter William Safire put it, the main Navy building died hard, but die it did. When the building came down in 1970, Nixon remarked to Ehrlichman, "We have finally gotten something done." With respect to the district, the administration did even more. It established within the District of Columbia a state-like structure that included a court system and an elected mayor, city council, as well as a vigorous program of economic development capped by the Washington, D.C. Metro. Nixon supported such measures even though he could expect no narrow electoral political benefit from helping the predominantly African-American and Democratic, capital D, population of Washington. But he could hope for a broader political windfall as he demonstrated his capacity to govern a racially divided country and a riot-scarred capital, and to bring us together, another promise from the 1968 campaign. So let's examine how Nixon redeemed his promises to the country as a whole and to the District of Columbia in particular. And I would just point out here, in terms of beginning our discussion, 11 days into the administration of Richard Nixon, he issued this message on the District of Columbia. And again, you can get this in the public papers of Richard Nixon in 1969. You will see here in the introductory part a good deal of discussion about violence and violent crime. And it's important to know that his law and order message was seen by some people, by many people, as a racial code word. But here you also have a discussion, a little bit of a discussion of restoring the district, of home rule. So you've got a reformist impulse as well. Nixon talked about law and order. Hubert Humphrey in 1968 talked about law and order with justice. And although Nixon's not using law and order with justice, that terminology, you can see elements of it embedded. And you notice the part here that's highlighted in yellow The major initiatives were a swift start on restoring those areas devastated 10 months ago by the rioting after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., a package of proposals in the area of crime, and lastly, a commitment to give the people of the District of Columbia the voice they legitimately could have in the public policies that affect their lives. What I want to do now is just to very briefly and in order introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to go to each panelist individually and have them talk about how they got to the Nixon administration, and then we will move on and continue our discussion. So furthest to your left is Egil Bud Krogh, who was appointed Deputy Assistant to the President in 1969 and served on John Ehrlichman's Domestic Council in a number of capacities, including dealing with narcotics control and District of Columbia issues. And right next to him is Sallyanne Payton, who is now the William W. Cook Professor of Law Emerita at the University of Michigan. She was a staff assistant on the Domestic Council, working on issues involving the District of Columbia, and later she went to the Urban Mass Transportation Administration in the Department of Transportation before ultimately going to the University of Michigan. And Donald E. Santarelli served in a number of capacities in the area of law enforcement in the Nixon administration, including Associate Deputy Attorney General, Administrator for the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, and Counsel to the President. And before that, he served as counsel to both the Senate and the House Judiciary Committees. So he has a very unique perspective here on the workings of the legislative and executive branches. And I will simply move over here and begin a little bit more of an informal discussion with each of our panelists, starting here with Don and this picture. So Don, could you tell us how you got to the Nixon administration?
Well, like a famous songwriter said, I waltzed around the office with my winning smile, polished up the knocker on the big front door, and got to be captain of the Queen's Navy. Confluence of serendipity and timing. We have to understand what was going on in terms of the zeitgeist of the times. Crime was a big political issue. Mr. Nixon referred to it on repeated occasions during his campaign. And I happened to be on the Hill working at that time, at that very moment, for the Senate Judiciary Committee under Sam Ervin, who was chairman of the Subcommittee on the Constitution, working on crime legislation, which was slowly not moving. I became very interested in bail reform, which then became preventive detention, and I was writing white papers, and it came to the attention of a man named John Mitchell and a team who were organizing the campaign for Mr. Nixon. My paper got to their attention. They were very interested in it, and began conversations with the campaign, and we put together a little group of people of us on the Hill, and we began writing transition papers. And when the election occurred, naturally, the guy who writes the transition paper gets to do something about it. And so with this team that you see here in this picture, Mr. Nixon was so anxious to have competent ideas from the Justice Department, where I was at the time, that he brought the entire team over there of the staff who was writing the transition materials, one of whom became the U.S. Attorney later, that is Earl Silbert, and Carl Rao, whose father was a prominent civil rights activist, David Prosser, who's now on the Supreme Court of the state of Wisconsin, etc. Mr. Nixon wanted to meet the people who he was going to rely on. And at that meeting, he assigned me the responsibility to captain the team.
Is that why he's pointing to you? You're more in the foreground?
That's correct. But the better part of that is that he said to me, you know, it's swearing me in to my job 11 days after the administration. This is unprecedented timing for the District of Columbia to be on his radar so soon after the inauguration. He said to me, it's customary to call your mother and I'll congratulate her. And I said, no, call my mother-in-law. And he did, and she answered the phone, and I was a success in my mother-in-law's view forever thereafter. Anyway, it was the opportunity to ride a wave. The wave was anti-crime legislation. The wave was to focus on the District of Columbia to make it a safer place as the model city that he had in mind, and he articulated it repeatedly. I talked to him with some frequency. Bud Krogh was my colleague in this matter. He made sure that I got to talk to the president so that there was no one between us. The two of us were assigned the job to make the District of Columbia a better place. And part of it was to revive and reorganize the justice system, not just courts. We revised everything, created. Mr. Nixon personally was interested in a public defender's office, which the district had never had. And in our statute, we created a model defender's office.
Since you mentioned Bud, I think it's good to transition to Bud and ask how you came to the White House. And here again, we're doing this with each of the three panelists. The archivist and the staff really out at the Nixon Foundation and the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda were able to uncover some photographs from, I guess you could say a long time ago, but hopefully not, maybe not too long ago. So you might want to talk about this picture as you talk about how you came to work on the Domestic Council in 1969.
In 1969, and I guess Don used the term serendipity as one of the influences that got him to the White House, or actually to the Department of Justice. I think we just were in the White House together so much that somehow I think of you as just being a colleague right there.
I had a White House pass.
Had a White House pass. That's a, you're back. So anyway, I graduated from law school in June of 1968 in Seattle, Washington. I had been clerking for John D. Ehrlichman's law firm for 2 years before I joined the firm after passing the bar in September of 1968. Some of you might remember that as a presidential election year, and President Nixon prevailed by just a squeaker of a vote in November of 1968. And I'm giving you these dates because the date of this picture is November 26, 1969. And you can sort of see, wow, a lot happened during that year. Right after the election in 1968, John D. Ehrlichman was appointed counsel to the president, and which was a significant position. Bob Haldeman was the chief of staff, and John came up to Seattle to sort of shut down his law firm. And at this point, I had been a practicing lawyer for 63 days, so I had quite a bit of experience in the law. And he came to my office, and I wasn't actually in the floor with the main lawyers. I had sort of an adjunct office on the 11th floor, which is 10 floors below the main office, and was just getting started. And he came into my office, and he said, well, Bud, do you like your job here? I said, well, yes, I do. And he said, well, would you consider changing your job? I said, well, yes, sir, I would. He said, well, would you consider leaving Seattle, leaving the firm, to come to Washington, D.C. to be staff assistant to the counsel to the president? Yes. Did you know there's no gap between the question and my answer? Yes. I mean, it just flowed exactly right on that. Well, that was on a Tuesday, and on Friday, I found myself in New York City at the president's transition headquarters, where he had set up shop about 2 blocks away from his co-op there, I think, on Fifth Avenue, and thus began sort of the whirlwind experience. I think it was within about 3 or 4 weeks after being there, it was decided that the staff of the transition needed to get together with those who had been working on some of the transition papers on law enforcement, District of Columbia, home rule, issues like that. So John Ehrlichman and I took a trip to Washington, D.C., where I met Mr. Santarelli for the first time, along with 3 of his colleagues. I think it was Brian Gettings and John Dean and Pete Velde. And it was in the office of Senator Roman Huruska. And we talked a little bit about what they had been working on, and I was amazed.
Huruska was ranking Republican on the House Senate Judiciary Committee.
That's right. He was the ranking Republican on the
Senate
Senate Judiciary Committee. And this, I think, was the first senator that I had met as part of that work. And the senator said, well, these are gentlemen who can help you put together some of the materials for the president as you go forward. And I think there was some direction at the time or a suggestion that John Ehrlichman might consider having two people join the administration, which was Don and John Dean, I think, were the two, and then Brian Gettings became a U.S. Attorney.
U.S. Attorney, Eastern District of Virginia.
And I point this out because the team was being put together during the transition period. That partnership with Don that started, I believe it was in early December of 1968. This was within a month after the election. The team was put together. We all came to Washington, D.C. together, and sort of the rest was history. But that's how I got there. I had no background and experience in major policy initiatives, but I said I have been practicing law for 63 days, so I did have that body of knowledge.
And I think we should point out here, this is the Oval Office.
It is.
And we have Richard Nixon meeting with...
We have Richard Nixon. They're paying rapt attention to the mayor of the District of Columbia, Walter Washington. I'm sort of right across from the president. And then
the only one with glasses here.
Well, the one with the glasses, yeah.
And John Ehrlichman, you can't see his
John
face.
John Ehrlichman is, sitting forward there and paying attention to what's going on. I want to point out here that this relationship, this friendship between the president and Walter Washington was critical to the work that followed. They established rapport almost within a week and a half after the president was inaugurated. They met each other. In the first message that was put on the screen, the president talked about the cooperation that had been established between the federal government and the district government. And what he was alluding to was the relationship between Walter Washington and the president. It was my privilege to be able to work closely with Mayor Washington throughout the time that I was on the White House staff. And as we go into our story later on, I think people will begin to see that Walter Washington was probably the key person in being able to move forward the home rule initiatives, the self-government initiatives, the anti-crime initiatives, the economic development initiatives that were all part of the president's program when we started out in January of 1969.
And I think before I turn to Sallyanne, just one thing about John D. Ehrlichman here and his very important role in the Nixon administration as the chief domestic advisor. At one point, Nixon wrote Ehrlichman a memo in which he said to him, "You have substantively seen to it, you've handled our domestic initiatives with great style and have substantively seen to it that they have come out along my own lines of thinking."
Yeah, I think that there was a real, I don't want to call it a Vulcan mind meld between the president and John Ehrlichman in domestic policy, but they certainly did line up on a lot of the issues that John took on. John was probably the best boss you could have had in domestic policy. He listened, he was very attentive to the staff. He gave his staff members a lot of flexibility and a lot of backing. When we'd make a proposal to him, he'd think it through, but once he decided to back us, it was just total. And then the president would back up John and back me up and Sallyanne and Don when we would make proposals to him. It was really an extraordinary example of a president setting the tone, setting the vision, setting the goals, and then having staff be able to come in and carry it out. But John was clearly the domestic policy leader in everything that we did.
Nixon elicited ideas from us. He was open to tell us a good way to do this.
Exactly, yeah.
As I worked on Nixon and civil rights and found a lot of these programs that were very progressive and pragmatic, some of my colleagues in academia wanted to dismiss them, saying, well, he didn't care about them, he didn't know anything about them. It was George Shultz who desegregated the southern schools, this, that, and the other thing. And I really made the point that it was Nixon who hired these people. He gave them, what they did was not something that he was uninformed about. He was an enormously well-informed president.
Don't miss the point. Nixon was a brilliant executive. He had the capacity to analyze and synthesize quickly complex ideas, translate them into action phrases. It was impressive to see him as an executive.
And here we're going to turn our attention to Sallyanne Payton, and she would tell us a little bit about the picture at some point, but tell us how you got to the Nixon administration.
Well, I, like Bud, whom I've always regarded as this amazing superior elder, it turns out we both graduated from law school in June of 1968, and I declined to clerk because I was bored with academic law and went directly into the practice of law at Covington and Burling in Washington, D.C. Covington, to its great merit, this was a breakthrough thing for Covington in many different ways. I was not only an African American and a woman, but most importantly, I was from California. And that was the truest breakthrough of all for a Washington law firm in 1968. They indeed had hired a bunch of Californians. They thought they had to do critical mass, so we'd have somebody to talk to who would talk this weird talk that Californians talked, if you know what I mean. We're kind of this foreign element that they had brought in to see if we could successfully be civilized. But one of the things they did was they assigned me to do what was in the terms of the time men's work. I don't know if you know anything about the organization of a law firm, but usually the men do the litigation, the men do the administrative stuff, the men do the client contact and all of that. The women, back in the days when women were expected to be nice girls, housewives, and needed to have low-intensity assignments from their law firms, if they were in law firms at all, so that they could go home and take care of their children, you know, and take the time off for the vacations and all that. So I came along, and I did not fit the mold of, you know, somebody's nice daughter, and so Covington treated me as though I was one of the guys. And they assigned me to the transportation practice, which was not only a regular commercial assignment, but a slightly macho one. You know, the transportation people are building the world and know it and act that way. And so all of a sudden, I was representing airlines and shipping concerns and other big transportation entities and worrying about, you know, jute rates from India and all of that sort of stuff, and going to the Interstate Commerce Commission where there were no girls in the Interstate Commerce Commission hearing rooms. It was stunning, but what it did was give me a transportation background. And in my voluminous spare time, I was assigned to go take care of a settlement house over in east of the river in southeast Washington, the Southeast House, which was working on a methadone program under Mr. DuPont, Bob DuPont. So when one day one of my colleagues at Covington walked into my office and closed the door behind her and said, "Would you consider working for the administration?" I said, well, let's see what they have in mind. This was a time when Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Ehrlichman were on the cover of Time magazine, and Mitchell were the bad guys, the ogres of the Nixon administration. And so I, you know, took a long breath and said, well, let's see what they have in mind. And a few months later, I got a call from Ehrlichman's office. And I went over to see John Ehrlichman, and Ehrlichman, and to our enormous surprise, we hit it off perfectly on all cylinders right from the first minute. We were both interested in urban development, in transportation development, in decentralization, all of that. It was really quite astonishing. I remember having staggered out of the office saying, I can't believe I've had this experience. And I think he probably did the same. So that's how I went to work for the Nixon administration, John Ehrlichman in particular, and then was assigned to Bud, and Bud said, we need for you to get the metro built and rebuild the riot corridors. Well, that was what I had been doing, right? So I just took my portfolio down the street to the White House and kept on working and on what I had been working on, and here we were. And so it was just wonderful thereafter. That's how I came to the White House.
I just want to say one thing, that when after the meeting that Sallyanne had with John Ehrlichman, he staggered out of his office to my office and said, "I've met the most amazing lady, and you're going to love her." And my gosh, it was serendipity, to use
totally.
Don's term, because it was just she came as a godsend at the time that we really needed that kind of help. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Covington, for training me.
And Sallyanne, before I let you go, the picture here, do you remember when that was?
Oh, yes, it was in April of 1971, and the president had just appointed a bunch of women to his administration, and which was breakthrough, and he had this photo op, and may I talk a little about what he said? Because this is, I don't know that you're going to talk to Barbara Franklin. That's Barbara Franklin in the picture sitting with him, I think. He said that he spent more time with us than he had intended to, and what he said was, we have to beat the Russians, and in order to do that, we need all of our brains, and half of the brains are female. And therefore, I want to bring women into the administration. I want to promote the fortunes of women, and I want you to do everything you think you need to do, and we will back you up. And that was true for the rest of the administration. It was really quite stunning.
And this is just, for the audience here, a brief timeline and overview of some of the things that we're going to be talking about. Now, I've already mentioned the message to Congress. We're going to start off by talking about the fighting of crime. Economic development will come next, and home rule. And we're not trying to separate these issues in some sort of artificial way. I mean, they're almost like running along the same track, intersecting, and things along those lines. But that is basically the structure of our discussion for the next hour or so. And so what we're going to do now is turn to Don and to talk a little bit about fighting crime and Nixon's crime initiatives and how important they were and what was actually accomplished.
There was almost a fever pitch in the District of Columbia about the crime issue. We're following the terrible events of the 60s, the assassinations, the violence that was associated with riots. The city was half burned down in '68. And so there was a hyper attitude, even to the point where the publisher of the Washington Post had a private meeting with John Ehrlichman.
And this is Katharine Graham, right?
Yes, saying you must do something about the city. Everybody was in almost a panic. Then the press and the news media hyped it up, because there is nothing more sensational to the reader than crime stories, and it's been ever since time immemorial. Crime gets the front page of the newspaper. So before Nixon announced his program, the media was literally in a countdown phase. They would say, it's 3 days, it's 2 days, till Nixon announces his crime program. It was amazing to be in almost a maelstrom of storm. As a result, we had a package, because we had been working during the transition. And Nixon, particularly personally, but through Bud officially, monitored every step of the way. So what we did was decided we would have a comprehensive program, not just more police, not just more this and more that. We would revise and reform the criminal justice system of the District of Columbia, rewrite the statutes, create and improve on social services. We ultimately became the pioneer on methadone maintenance as a way in which to deal with the drug program. Imagine talking about that to somebody today. We had methadone clinics on practically every corner. We immediately cut the heroin-related crime. We put a czar for the first time in the White House in Dr. DuPont, and later brought in a neurotoxicologist, Jerry Jaffe. We were serious about dealing with the crime issue, not just as a lock 'em up, but as a treatment type issue. So the comprehensive program was designed for the entire community, and Nixon himself monitored. He would call on the telephone. He would set up meetings. He would make calls to the Congress to get a project moving, and we have a slide that will show that in a minute. The reaction was strange. The liberal establishment, which was very strong at the time, was suspicious of it because it came from Nixon, whose reputation had been hyped up as having won an election on a racial theme. So the professional liberal organizations, like the ACLU, and the Friends, the Quakers were very strong politically in those days, required, and the bar was suspicious of it too, required us to have an outreach program, which Bud and I were part of. I spent most of my time on the road making explanations to people in organizations around the city, putting on forums, doing speeches, sitting in classrooms, educating them as to what was in the bill. The district committees of that Congress in those days, Congress had a House and Senate district committee, were a little suspicious, but it didn't take them long, and particularly the left, led by Joe Tidings, Senator Joe Tidings, said this is a good idea, and had to persuade other people. So it was an uphill battle in that sense. Now, I could talk about what the contents of it were, but
thought we maybe
I'll save some time.
Yeah, take a look at some images here, and I think the audience can see the DC crime statistics that we have here about an average week with the number of homicides, rapes, auto thefts, burglaries, and that the crime rate was increasing. So this was, an important issue. And then tell us a little bit about this.
Well,
please.
Nixon was so interested in how this was going to work that he went to this D.C. Metropolitan Police Department Training Academy to address the trainees personally. And there he is in that montage. Mitchell is behind him, and Chief Jerry Wilson is standing tall with his cap. He was a very tall fellow.
And he's the chief of the Washington, D.C.
Well, there's an interesting story there. That the police department had low morale, and it had a wonderful older gentleman who was the chief, John Layton, a gentleman of the old school, but was determined that he wasn't up to the kind of reform that the president wanted. So I got the assignment to go visit Chief Layton, who I said, Chief, to suggest that he might want to retire. It was one of the early lieutenant jobs that you get in an administration. And we promoted Jerry Wilson. The president himself promoted Jerry Wilson, even though it wasn't within his authority, and gave Jerry a mantle to act as aggressively as he could within the limits of the then sensitivities to constitutional issues. And I could talk about that for a long time, because I'm a libertarian at heart. Jerry was so famous that here he is on the cover of Time magazine as the new hope for the District of Columbia. Now, if Time is recognizing this initiative in the District of Columbia with that kind of news, you can tell how intense the public interest was in what the president was doing in the District of Columbia. Now, there's another slide that I think would be useful. Nixon was so interested in the progress of this legislative package of his that he called into the cabinet room the leadership of the Congress. There's Senator Mansfield, a majority leader in the Senate, Senator Tidings, and the Judiciary committees and the district committees, and Pat Buchanan on the side, smiling. And there's Jerry Wilson briefing the Congress. There's Dick Kleindienst, the Deputy Attorney General, and there's this little lieutenant who is still bleeding from having fired Layton. Nixon promoting his program. Now, we created a court.
Don, before you go on, just a little bit about Jerry Wilson. Some might remember that in 1969 there were major anti-war demonstrations all around the country, as well as here in the District of Columbia. And there was one called the New Mobilization against the war in Vietnam. This was in November. I think Jerry Wilson, I don't know how long he'd been there. He hadn't been there very long.
Very short.
But I was up on the top floor of the Justice Department in the Attorney General's office, and some of the demonstrators, and I would say probably 2,000 or 3,000 of them, had gotten outside the route that had been part of their permit. And when the police came in to move them back, Jerry Wilson was out in front by himself, going right up to this group and saying, you're outside your parade route or your permit. You need to turn around and go back. And as Don said, he's a tall person, very courageous. Just the power of that personality. Turn around. They turned around and went back. I mean, it was really quite extraordinary to
Didn't
watch.
save him and me from being defendants in a civil lawsuit
Well,
for the next 10 years.
That happens.
I just, for the audience, would like to contextualize what was going on with the New Mob. This is around the time when Nixon told Ehrlichman, I need to focus on Vietnam. I can't see you for the next 9-10 days, so any of the domestic decisions, bring them to me, and I got to get on top of this issue of Vietnam. And that's when he came up with, he drafted the very famous Great Silent Majority speech, which was immensely effective in rallying public opinion. So it was in that context when all of this was going on. And we were moving on to talk a little bit about the District of Columbia Superior Court. 1970 was this established?
Yes, but we phased it in. This is a picture of the entire court that was created from scratch. The District of Columbia had a very inadequate court system because the federal courts, because this was a federal city, handled all of the District of Columbia civil and criminal litigation, except for the most minor misdemeanors, which were handled in a court called the Court of General Sessions. This idea of creating a new court, taking all the jurisdiction out of the federal courts and giving it to a state court, Nixon's directive and in his statements, I won't bother to read, but I'll refer to them, said, create a state-like structure so that the District of Columbia will be not just a city, but an integral sovereign. We created a superior court giving it general jurisdiction and adding 30 new judges, all of whom were solicited by a variety of us to serve on this new court. We wrote real reforms. One of them is lasting to this day, a joint committee on administration of justice made up of the two courts to run the court system and a chief executive for the court system. Never had happened before. These were tremendous reforms that a lot of the old guard was a little suspicious of. Is this court packing? Is this the Nixon with a swastika instead of an X plan for tyranny in the District of Columbia? In fact, there is the court, and the chief judge of that court, Harold Green, who was a civil rights activist from the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, a Democrat appointee. We incorporated him into the court, writes this little message on there saying, to you guys who are responsible for the existence of this court, I worked, and Bud too, with Harold Green for the entire period of drafting the legislation. We did not draft it in a vacuum. We did not draft it in the bowels of the Department of Justice. We drafted that with the input of the court, the then existing courts, the federal courts as well. Even Alexander Holtzoff, distinguished liberal district of court judge, vetted everything that we wrote. We were determined to do it right, and that was Nixon's objective. No politics, no directives from the president except make it the best you could. We were proud to have done that work, and that court exists to this day and is renowned around the country.
And here we have Nixon with
Jerry Wilson, the chief,
and Walter Washington.
and Walter Washington talking about the implementation of the District of Columbia reforms, and the deputy mayor.
Okay.
Deputy Mayor Graham Watt in that picture, along with the president, Mayor Washington, and Chief Wilson.
We're going to turn our attention a little bit here to economic development, but I'm going to ask you to talk about what a little bit of overview, context, and also what we're going to be seeing in the next couple of slides.
Right. I think, as we said at the outset, that Mr. Nixon's goal for the District of Columbia was to make it a great capital city. He had lived here, as we pointed out, as Dean pointed out at the beginning. He loved the city. He felt that he had to do what he could to bring it back to a state of grandeur, to where it had been. And one of the first things that he had to do was to support the rehabilitation of a lot of the areas in the city that had been damaged by the riots the previous year. In this picture, the mayor, Walter Washington, is there with Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, George Romney.
And he's immediately in the foreground. He's
He's
closest
immediately,
to
you can't, yeah, he's looking towards the president, pointing out what some of the work was going to be. And that was the principal funding source for getting the resources to be able to bring back a lot of those areas. Now, it took a long time, but right at the beginning, they started trying to build some small parks, trying to get 7th, 14th, 8th Street back to some degree of livability, but it took a long time to do that. As I say, Mr. Nixon's overarching idea was to make this a great capital city, and he emphasized these basic themes of safety, which Don has talked about, and crime control, economic development, environmental considerations, and home rule and self-government. Home rule was part of this January 31, 1969 message, very clearly stated there. He had been a supporter of home rule ever since, I think, 1948, when I believe he first voted for it, as I think you pointed out, Dean. So he had a record of endorsing the initiatives as they came along. He wrote some things about home rule in these messages that were very, very strong.
In his first message, for more than 29 years, I have supported home rule for the District of Columbia.
29 years, that's right. And I think that maybe he was a precursor to some of the license plates that we have, because he inveighed against taxation without representation, saying, I thought we solved this 200 years ago. This should be a capital city, not a colony. I mean, the language that he used was very strong, and it was within 11 days of being inaugurated. And it was not new. It was consistent. It was part of an overarching policy that he had supported from the time he had been a congressman.
Never forget that this is in the context of a president of the United States with the tremendous problem of Vietnam and national unrest, and he's focusing his energies and attentions on the District of Columbia.
But I'm sorry, I didn't want to interject, but when Bud mentioned treated as a colony, he also used that kind of rhetoric with American Indian tribes.
Yes,
they should no longer be treated as a colony within a nation. And we also see during the Nixon administration, non-voting representation for the district, and also, I believe, for Guam and some of the other territories in 1970. So you see, again, these policies do fit together.
They do. I think you pointed out in your opening comments, Dean, that self-determination, devolving power back to, whether it's the tribes, the District of Columbia, the states, through revenue sharing and the rest, was part and parcel of his overall political philosophy. Move power back to that level of government that can perform it most effectively. And you mentioned the non-voting delegate. What I found fascinating was, in reviewing the timing in all this, was that in this message, January 31, 1969, he supports the non-voting delegate, and he uses it as an interim measure. I mean, this has been quite an interim, actually, when you think about the timing. But as an interim measure, but strongly supported a constitutional amendment for voting representation for the District of Columbia. I mean, that was right at the beginning, and it followed up with another message in April of 1969 where he went into greater detail. But he's laying the foundation right at the beginning for the District of Columbia becoming this great capital city. Economic development was a critical part of it. And I'd like to just talk a little bit briefly about one of the initiatives that he strongly supported, and that was, what is WMATA, Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, known as Metro. He supported regional rail right from the beginning. They were part of his message in April of 1969. He saw the importance of it. accepted the expansion of Metro from a 25-mile system to a 97-mile system, which I know it's, I think, 103.6. But Metro faced, I would say, an existential threat to its survival in 1971. And that threat came about because of a conflict between some of the members in the, I would say, the House Subcommittee of Appropriations for the District of Columbia, the mayor's office, city council, other people in the city, over the funding that Metro needed to come up with through that appropriations subcommittee in order for the Metro construction to go forward. This precise issue had to do with the decision that put into the federal highway bill, I think it was in two of them, 1968, 1970, that a bridge should be constructed over the Potomac on the Three Sisters rocks out there, which are right adjacent to Georgetown.
Key Bridge.
It was just north of Key Bridge, probably maybe a quarter mile. And it was going to take traffic off of GW Parkway and move it directly in the city over a bridge that was going to be constructed on those three rock islands, the Three Sisters. This was a matter of enormous concern in the District of Columbia. There were demonstrations that were occurring regularly about it. Some of them became violent. But the chairman of that District of Columbia Appropriations Subcommittee, Mr. Natcher.
His picture is in that scene of the president briefing the Congress.
Okay.
If you go back to it.
Yeah, we could. All right. Can we go back to it? And maybe you can show Don where he might be. See.
Just behind Haruska.
Just behind Senator Haruska.
Is Natcher. And between Tidings and Haruska is Natcher. And we did a lot of work with him to build the courthouse, too. He didn't want to appropriate that money either.
Well, Congressman Natcher, chairman of that subcommittee on appropriation, made it very clear that unless the District of Columbia and its legislative body, the City Council, voted in favor of the Three Sisters Bridge, he would not release the funding for the District of Columbia for its share of Metro construction. That was $216 million. Without the district's share, the federal share would not be triggered. And without those two shares, we could not count on the construction going forward. This was a threat that hung over Metro for a long time, until finally the president said, we have to solve this. This is not something that we can stand. We cannot stop the construction of Metro. It has to go forward. And he even pointed out in one of his statements that we had holes dug all over the city for stations and tunnels and the rest. And the prospect of losing Metro was real, but something that the president felt was unacceptable. He got directly involved in helping to get support for moving forward with Metro. Through, I think, an act of great political courage, the City Council voted against some of its own political instincts and intuitions and voted in favor of the Three Sisters Bridge. That triggered the release of the funding from the House Subcommittee on Appropriations.
We built 2 courthouses and a post office.
In
Mr. Natcher.
In Mr. Natcher's I'm glad to know that, Don. I wasn't quite sure what the entire consideration, I guess that's the right word.
Consideration.
Its consideration was for this, but the money was released, and after a set period of time, and the construction of Metro was assured that it would go forward, the City Council and others made a decision to remove the Three Sisters Bridge from one of the construction items to which it had agreed to earlier. This was a muscular effort on the part of the president. It wasn't something where he put me and others out to dry. I mean, he would back it up with phone calls. The business community of Washington, D.C. was very actively involved. Chairman Gil Hahn was magnificent in being able to step up and see what needed to be done. But the president's idea was that we can't lose Metro. When you think about what would have happened if we had shut down Metro in 1971, filled in the holes, where would we be today? As an entity? It's a prospect that, I mean, it's very, I mean, I would say that probably a lot of you might have taken Metro today. I mean, it is just part of the substantive part of the city.
And I thought, Sallyanne, you might want to interject because you had something.
The fight over the D.C. Metro was part of a larger fight between the highway interests and the mass transportation interests, the urban interests, because at just that time, the highway people were trying to come in from the beltways and cut the highways right through downtown areas. And part of the resistance to that consisted of the urban interests getting permission to take their highway funds and swap them. It was called the swap, and use the money instead for transit. Well, this was pitched battle. This was pitched battle, and what the highway people knew was that if the D.C. Metro succeeded in stopping that entry of the highway into the District of Columbia, then they would lose nationwide on that very issue because D.C. was a beacon. And so this fight had national implications, and the fact that the Nixon administration won this fight laid the groundwork for all subsequent development of urban mass transportation in this country.
And although it's outside of my area of expertise, it does remind me of Robert Caro's book about Robert Moses.
Totally.
And how Moses really wanted to eliminate any kind of competition with rails and things along those lines. And if you read the book, there are all sorts of ways in which he did it. That representing the forces of the highway ideology, you could call it. That was the wave of the future, automobiles. And here, thank God for the Metro today.
And the coalition that President Nixon put forward, Donna was talking earlier a little bit about how some of the steps that we took were not necessarily lined up with his party and political party and the rest. The coalition that was put together in the House of Representatives included members of the very liberal Democrats, liberal Republicans, and the Black Caucus. And we were up against conservative Democrats, conservative Republicans, and the full House GOP leadership. That included Minority Leader Ford. And it got down to a very, very tight vote that I remember the day we won it by 4 votes. It was very, very tight, approving the appropriation for Metro.
And my understanding, too, is this is almost the rule for the Nixon administration. People talked about, I think Bryce Harlow and then political scientists, talked about a floating coalition strategy, where whatever they were pushing, they would assemble the coalition. It was not some straight Republican line, party line. But it couldn't be because the Republicans didn't have a majority in the House and the Senate. But it wasn't even necessarily a conservative Democrat-Republican coalition because they were doing all sorts of different things in all sorts of different areas, and that created all sorts of different coalitions that you needed.
That's correct.
That's correct. Does anyone want to say anything about the picture here before we move on?
Well, that's the construction of Metro, and I'm not quite sure what city it is. Maybe somebody in the audience can tell what street.
What street?
I'm
going to guess that it's F Street.
F?
I'm going to guess, but that could be,
Well, that could be. We had an earlier slide up about the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation. I don't know if that's what you'd like to address.
If you want to briefly mention it, I can go way back here.
Again, and in your opening comments, Dean, you did mention about the strong influence of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was the Urban Affairs staff person, actually special assistant to the President for Urban Affairs. And he had been on the Pennsylvania Avenue Commission, I believe under President Johnson, and really could see the importance of bringing back Pennsylvania Avenue. In doing some of the research, I thought it was fascinating that Thomas Jefferson in 1803 designated Pennsylvania Avenue as the official parade route for the District of Columbia. And it had fallen into disrepair in 1969. And the President became very supportive of bringing back Pennsylvania Avenue, and part of the plan for the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation, or the Commission, was to build new parks. I think there's Pershing Park, there are a number of others. I think partly the restoration of the Willard Hotel, the National Theater, the Marine or the Navy Memorial, all of them were part of the eventual development that was brought about by the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation.
If you look at that picture in the far background, the dark building with the gabled roof is the so-called pension building.
Yes.
Meigs designed and built, General Meigs, after the Civil War. That's where we moved the Superior Court for the interim period while we were building the courthouse.
And today's the National Building Museum.
That's right.
Yeah. And the one thing that I was struck by, and I didn't mention this in my opening remarks, but that preface that Moynihan wrote to the report, he really played upon the idea of history. He mentioned Washington and Jefferson in terms of the Capitol, talked about a refurbishment of the Capitol under Grant, President Grant, and then under Theodore Roosevelt, and then under Kennedy and Johnson. And he noticed that all of these things had happened roughly about 50 years apart, and that the Nixon period was a continuation of the Kennedy-Johnson refurbishment of the Capitol.
That's right. I think that's right. And in fact, I think President Kennedy even observed one of the stories is in his inauguration coming down and said, things aren't looking very good here in Pennsylvania Avenue right now. And President Johnson said, things aren't looking very good here. I mean, it was just, and then finally it was Mr. Nixon, we are going to do what we can to fix this. And of course now I think Pennsylvania Avenue is a marvelous promenade. I mean, Don, I know you have office there. I mean, you have
I look down on the archives.
and the music playing from the Navy Memorial.
Personal serenade.
There you go.
And moving on to District of Columbia Home Rule. And you can see, although we've called this Home Rule involves more than simply voting and having a mayor and elected. It entails crime and these other issues as well. But getting to more of the Home Rule aspect, Sallyanne, do you want to proceed here? Maybe tell us what we're seeing, and then we'll get into the Nelson Commission a bit.
Well, this, of course, is a picture of Walter Fauntleroy, the president. He was the non-voting delegate. Let me just...
Elected.
Let me just talk about Home Rule for a second. It is the disease of people who love democracy that they ignore administration. And the fact is that you cannot you can have a democracy, you know, in a snake pit if all you care about is voting. But the point is to have a prosperous, secure place that supports economic activity and therefore supports the aspirations of the people who live in the jurisdiction. America is not built on democracy alone. It is built on an attitude of promoting enterprise, of promoting individuals to be able to go into business for themselves, to become educated, all of that. That's all part of what it means to have a prosperous and exciting state that is self-governing. So what Mr. Nixon was doing was putting all those other systems in place in order to make sure that when Home Rule came, the citizens of the district would inherit a jurisdiction worth having, if you will, a jurisdiction that was going to express their best selves and was going to be prosperous in a way. Now, remember that
Which is the courthouse concept. The whole concept was to give them an infrastructure.
Give them an infrastructure. It's all about infrastructure. And so, in addition, yes, that's all I want to say. So the president's program for the district had all of these various different components. There was the infrastructure, there was the reorganization of the District of Columbia government itself and the conferring on it of additional powers.
And Sallyanne, I think one of the things that the president acknowledged right at the beginning was we had to have a blueprint for how to do this.
Yes.
And he supported a commission right from the beginning in 1969 that we needed to have something in-depth, and it needed to be a commission that flowed out of the legislature, out of the Congress. Because under the Constitution, and Don, you can tell me exactly what part of the Constitution that exclusive jurisdiction for the district is vested in Congress.
In the Congress.
In the
It
Congress.
says the Congress shall have exclusive jurisdiction over the District of Columbia.
So with that, it was clearly recognized early on that that commission would have to flow from the Congress. And when they put it together, as I recall, Sallyanne, there were members that were appointed by the House and the Senate and the White House.
And the White House.
And so the White House role at that point, it was something that was a continuation of what other presidents had done. I was designated as the liaison between the White House and the district government, which meant in the first couple of days that I called up and we would give orders, but that was only for 2 days, until I realized that the job really here is to be supportive and to help. What can we do to back you up? And I think that when it came to the Nelson Commission, we knew that we had to put people on that commission who could reflect the federal interest, the White House interest, as well as the district's interest, and because of the exclusive jurisdiction of the district being in the Congress, it had to have members from both the Senate and the House. So that's just a little background about how the commission sort of came about, and when Sallyanne joined the staff, there it was. The commission was in place, as I recall.
That's right.
But we had to extend it and give it more jurisdiction to look at more things so they could complete the work in developing the blueprint for what Home Rule eventually became.
So the home rule was a package. That's what Bud is saying. Home rule was actually a package that included the reorganization of the government and the delegations of actual legislative authority to the district people, to the district government. But without the package, the delegation would not have made any sense. It was the package that mattered. And it was the recommendations of the Nelson Commission, because it was chaired by Anchor Nelson, it was the recommendations of the Nelson Commission that then transitioned into being the legislation that established
And
the home
Sallyanne,
rule.
could you tell us about Nelson? Who was he? We're talking about Anchor Nelson.
Anchor
right?
Nelson, he was a congressman from Minnesota. He
Republican.
was Republican congressman from
Ranking Republican
Yes.
on the House
District
District
Committee.
of Columbia Committee.
And he had been the lieutenant governor of Minnesota, if I recall correctly. He was a man from the prairie who believed in individual potential and enterprise, and was determined to give the people of the District of Columbia a chance to have the opportunities that people in other parts of the country had.
He had a good heart.
He had a good heart, and he was behind the founding of the Washington Technical Institute, because he believed very much that black people in particular had never had an opportunity to become skilled in those industrial arts. And indeed, that had been part of the premise of the racial caste system, that the black men in particular were to be unskilled where the white men were allowed to be skilled. And so extending the opportunity to black people to become skilled was really quite a step. But he was behind that.
And it's something also that would underpin the Nixon administration's Philadelphia plan.
Absolutely.
Yeah, affirmative action. We're talking
And also, just a quick story about Washington Technical Institute, because the president was apprised of, I think, Congressman Nelson's interest in it, and wanted to go see it. So we arranged for a trip from the White House up Connecticut Avenue up to Washington Technical Institute, which at this point was located where I think the University of the District of Columbia is located today. I had arranged for this movement by the president. This was not my finest hour. But what we did was give the directions to the police as to where to get off Connecticut Avenue so he could go up to Washington Technical Institute and meet the president, Cleveland Denard, who was the person who had been administering WTI very effectively. And I remember going up Connecticut Avenue at speed, about 45 miles per hour, and I told them about a little driveway they were supposed to turn off to be able to get up to the school. And we went by that driveway at 45 miles an hour, just shoo, went right past it. And went up another 2 or 3 blocks, and then the lead motorcycle guy, and we got the president's limousine and the chase cars. Guy turns around, comes back, goes by Connecticut Avenue and the driveway again at 45 miles an hour. And the bystanders are, here he comes.
Yeah.
There he goes. Wonder where he's going. I wasn't quite sure. The president's looking out the window like, is this are we going someplace? This kind of thing. Well, it turned out that I had to get to the head of the detail by knocking on the window and said, would you please turn this around, tell the lead motorcycle, go very slowly, the driveway is right across. I gave him a landmark. Well, we eventually made it there, but when I got back to the head advancement, Ron Walker said, God, we can't let you take the president out anywhere. You don't know how to get there or to get back. But we had a great meeting with Mr. Denard when we were there, too. So.
The location of Washington Technical Institute on Connecticut Avenue was a measure in part designed to overcome the segregation in Washington, because what was happening, of course, was that Northwest was all white and past 16th Street, and black people were living to the east. That meant that if you were a black kid growing up in the District of Columbia, you never saw the affluence of the Northwest, and you never had access to those resources, to those sources of information, to the entire environment of the Northwest. And so what Dr. Denard wanted most of all was to get the WTI to be on Connecticut Avenue so that the students would have the opportunity and the requirement to travel over there, and the people in Northwest could become accustomed to seeing black people on Connecticut Avenue. There were no black people on Connecticut Avenue. I'm not kidding you. It was very interesting to live in the D.C. because it was...
For younger people, you have to appreciate that Connecticut Avenue had a posh-like reputation then.
Yeah, right. Well, at least north of Woodley Park, it's not... So, but anyway, that's part of the... And therefore very important to have the president's imprimatur on having WTI on Connecticut Avenue.
I wanted to pivot here just to the legislation and ask what you know about the passage of the home rule legislation. What I have here is this up on the screen is the signing statement. I'd like to talk just real briefly about it, but before we get to the signing statement, how much difficulty was there in passing home rule legislation in the period, let's say 1972, 73, that era, obstacles?
Well, I was no longer on the White House staff at that point. I think Sallyanne, maybe had we gone over together?
We'd gone over to DOT.
Okay.
We went over to the Department of Transportation. But what is interesting is the continuity of the staff work on home rule. After I left, I think this devolved, I believe, on Dana Mead, who took on the responsibility of developing the home rule package. He presented that to I believe Ken Cole or others as to what was going to be in it.
And I believe Ken Cole replaced Ehrlichman,
yes,
did he not?
Yes, he did, yeah. But when you look at the documents that were prepared by Dana and approved by Ken Cole, they were based upon the material, the information that had been developed by the Nelson Commission and what Sallyanne had done to work on that. And so there was, as I say, there was a continuity, there was sustained focus on it. I don't remember what the vote was actually on that, but maybe you have that information.
No, I don't have that. But again, the researchers who are going to, I mean, we're the opening door here to some extent to these topics. We'll be able to find that. With respect to this District of Columbia signing statement, the thing that strikes me is the second paragraph. So you maybe can talk more about other things here, and we can get into them. But the idea, one of the major goals of this administration is to place responsibility for local functions under local control and to provide local governments with the authority and resources they need to serve their communities effectively. The measure I signed today represents a significant step in achieving this goal in the city of Washington. It will give the people of the District of Columbia the right to elect their own city officials and to govern themselves in local affairs. This is what a lot of what we've been talking about was ultimately led to.
Absolutely. I mean, and it started well before the January 31st, 1969 message. I mean, there's a consistency, a continuity. And I'm not trying to just trumpet the work of people from various organizations, but it was not just White House staff people, Department of Justice people who were assigned to work on these issues, but the Office of Management and Budget. And we had full support from that organization from the top level down. Richard Nathan became the liaison for the District of Columbia for a full year and was the person who was, I think, primarily responsible for getting the acknowledgement of the non-voting delegate. The picture that you had up here a little bit earlier with Reverend Walter Fauntleroy and his family, there we can go back. The president, in his statement about 2 weeks later, said, "I had the privilege of congratulating Reverend Fauntleroy personally." Now, this is not just, well, somebody else is going to go do this. This is something he was directly engaged in and was proud of. Yeah. And I believe Reverend Fauntleroy served 10 terms as the non-voting delegate. Eleanor Holmes Norton, I'm not sure, but she's, I think, surpassed that.
Oh, I think
that record. I'm not quite sure how many terms that she has served, but that position, when you think about it, 1971, there's the first one and the last.
And you know what also was fascinating with me from the civil rights angle here is his difficult relationship with the more liberal wing of the civil rights, with the integrationist wing, you know, of the movement, Abernathy and so on and so forth. But Nixon would talk, and this is his language, about working with what he called moderate, responsible black leaders. And I would think Fauntleroy, Walter Washington, James Cheek of Howard University was somebody, the African-American, historically black colleges and universities, people who he wanted to work with, and Whitney Young as well. Some tension with Whitney Young, but they reached out to Whitney Young, and they were able to form some interesting partnerships through Ehrlichman's Domestic Council.
As early as July 1968, at the Republican National Convention, Nixon begins this dialogue about no distinction between black and white. Mm-hmm. There can be no color line between black murder and white murder, between black safety and white safety. We need not only equal enforcement of law, but equal protection of the law.
Mm-hmm.
May I follow up on your observation about who he got along with and whom he did not get along with? He was very comfortable with people who ran institutions because they had the same mindset. He loved the people who were running the black colleges. He understood the people who were running the black insurance companies. It's the same mindset. Where he was uncomfortable was where people were in the advocacy business and were not accountable. Okay, that's which is, no advocates are ever accountable. I don't mean to single out the civil rights advocates. You know, advocacy is not a job in which you're accountable.
And folks, that was very similar with the American Indians. The tribal leaders, they were, again, established power brokers who he could deal with. The American Indian movement of Russell Means, Dennis Banks, completely advocacy and publicity.
Right, exactly. The other thing that's peculiar about Mr. Nixon, and was peculiar about many other of the moderate Republicans, was that they had friends who were accomplished African Americans. And that's because they had to deal with Republican primaries. And in Republican primaries, the black upper middle class was very influential in the northern cities. And consequently, these guys had been hearing for years about the frustration of very talented African Americans. And they had I mean, real friendships and merely emotional relationships with people who wanted an opportunity to be in the level of society that actually ran the society. And that's part of the reason why he was so intent here.
Take him back to his...
That self-determination.
He was an executive in his heart and his mind, and even though he had never been an executive, this was his talent, and he resonated with other people who had executive responsibility.
That's exactly right.
You mentioned, Dean, Dennis Banks and Russell Means, and this sort of ties together sort of law enforcement in the District of Columbia, the president's deep interest in not hurting anyone from the American Indian movement, but 4 days before the election in 1972, and you might have been having this in mind, Dean, when you raised that, a group of Native Americans took over a building here in Washington, D.C. called the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
And they were calling themselves the Trail of Broken Treaties.
You got it, the Trail of Broken Treaties. And it turned out that for some odd reason, Walter Washington, the mayor, called me up on a Friday and said, I think if we execute the order that is coming down from the Justice Department right now and try to pull these people out of this building, that there could be some real serious repercussions. As a result, I was asked by the mayor, what do you think we should do? And I said, well, I don't think I would move with the police right now. So he sent the police home, which triggered some unhappiness on the part of people who had given this order. So over the next 4 days, it was a real difficult time because the then acting Attorney General, Richard Kleindienst, had managed to get a court order ordering this group to cease and desist from their state of trespass, or they would be forcibly removed. And it got right down to an hour before the order was to be executed, and marshals were going to go in, and they were going to use gas, and there was a plan to do it with 1,000 Native Americans in the building, women, children, and the rest. And it was a question, do we go and execute that order, or do we find some other way? And the stark choice was presented to President Nixon, who was just completing the campaign out in San Clemente, is that if we do use force, it's likely that some people are going to be hurt, maybe much more seriously. The president's direct order was shut it down, no bloodshed. Yeah. And he was not going to risk harming anyone within that group, even though they were in a state of trespass.
And even also we're getting a little bit on Indians, and we'll come back here, but Alcatraz Island, the same thing, they waited them out. Wounded Knee, there was a proposal, somebody floated the idea of tear gas, and Nixon said, there are going to be no dead babies at Wounded Knee on my watch, just lay off the gas.
Yeah. Well, he was very aware of what the effects would be if somebody had gotten hurt, but it goes back to that overarching idea of self-determination. When he visited the Lincoln Memorial right after the invasion of Cambodia, I happened to be up there and watch him tell these young people who were astonished that he was actually there that the Native Americans had been so terribly treated, just had been their cultures had been undermined. I mean, in very strong language. So he felt very strongly about trying to support self-determination for the Indian nation. And that was a theme throughout the work in the District of Columbia to really expand home rule. And over that 5-year period, when you think about what he accomplished, it was extraordinary, with many other people to help him, like Walter Washington and others.
I think we're almost finished.
Every afternoon has to come to an end. We could go on for a long time about these particular issues. They unfolded over years and years, but I'm going to let Dean wrap it up.
And I am going to wrap it up by just very, very briefly asking each of you in a minute or two to summarize what you think the most important ideas we should take from this whole topic of Nixon in the Washington, D.C. area in general and home rule in particular. And start out with Don and then move down the road.
Well, at heart, Nixon was a lawyer, and he was very interested in the structure of a legal system, which of course under rule of law means an independent court to keep government, the executive function, curbed, and to remind Congress that it doesn't have plenary authority to revise the world. So his belief that creating for the District of Columbia a comprehensive, modern, and independent judiciary was his gift to the state, to the municipalities, and he wanted to call it a state. This was my responsibility, so that's the part of him that I saw best, and therefore would focus my answer to your question.
Well, the thing that I am most impressed with has been the metro. Building a transit system like that is a little like planting seeds in your garden. And the first few years, you know, there's not much, and then this thing just begins to sprout. The metro has transformed the metropolitan area. It has brought people together. It has created centers where there were no centers before. If you, in the toughest parts of town, 11th Street, 14th Street, the metro station up there has led to a renaissance in those areas. This is a tremendous, it's just been a fantastic success. So.
Well, I see that 5-year period of Mr. Nixon's work in the district of really doing a lot to bring it back to a great capital city, starting from a position where so much had to be done in terms of reconstruction, development, making it a safe city. If I think the main themes were this can be a great city, it needs to be a safe city, a prosperous city, a democratic city, a self-governed city. Those are general terms, but those were, I think, the overarching themes, with self-determination and with a commitment of his effort and time. We've seen so many pictures of him out and about, looking at things, saying, yeah, we ought to do this. I mean, it's not just sitting and having people come in and brief him in the Oval Office. There's one of those. But he was an activist in trying to bring these things together, and it was extraordinary, I think, what he was able to accomplish with Walter Washington. And I want to emphasize that as the individual who spanned 3 presidencies, starting with President Johnson, President Nixon, and then with President Ford, and then he was elected and served, I think, 1 full term. I mean, it was extraordinary what he was able to accomplish along with the president.
And I would just stress here in concluding 3 points. All presidents have heroes of previous presidents, and Richard Nixon really liked Theodore Roosevelt. And there's something Theodore Rooseveltian about him getting out and looking at these things and seeing how they work. And I won't go into a lot of detail with that, but I think that stands out. I think also the idea of Washington, D.C., as it looks today, in terms of Pennsylvania Avenue, in terms of the metro, in terms of the absence of those buildings from the mall. The Washington, D.C. that we see today, a lot of it goes back to Richard Nixon. And that's not something that people connect Nixon with. And my final point here is there is an oversimplification about Richard Nixon that I alluded to in my opening comments. And I made sure to choose my words very carefully here. He was primarily interested in foreign affairs, but that doesn't mean he was exclusively interested in foreign affairs. There were many aspects of domestic policy that captured and caught and sustained his interest. And what I think we're learning here is that the District of Columbia was one of those issues. Would you all agree with that?
I would agree.
I would agree with that. And I also want to say that the focus and the attention, constant attention, is what did it.
Yes.
Okay, it's that constant attention. The phone call always got returned. The White House operation was set up so that for anything that the president was interested in, the phone calls got returned. The force of the White House was put in service of the objectives at all times. People could trust the White House to come through for them.
Never forget that there were no votes in the District of Columbia, that for him, all of the interest that he expressed and all the visits to things he met were not photo ops for a political reason. They really came from his executive heart, that he had the power to do something. There was a legitimate jurisdictional basis for the federal government to do things in the District of Columbia, and he wanted to do them because he believed in it.
And I think that that's an excellent and an eloquent point, really, to end on. And I want to thank my 3 distinguished panelists here, our 3 distinguished panelists, and the audience. This has been very enlightening and illuminating and provided, I think, really intellectual seeds for books and articles that will blossom in future years, expanding our understanding of Richard Nixon and the District of Columbia. Thank you all.